Hi everyone, my name is Susie Dawson. I'm a journalist and activist and the president of the Internet Party of New Zealand. Welcome to my channel. Today is the 7th episode of my new series, Opening the Five Eyes, Exposing the Spies. Tonight we'll be picking up where we left off last week, deciphering the JTRIG documents. I have again with me the clinical psychologist, Lissa K. Johnson. Hopefully you can hear me fine. Everyone, let me know in the chat if you can hear me and see me. Hi, I can see you. Great. Okay, excellent. Just before I bring Lissa on, I just want to let you guys know this stream is in support of my campaign, 1 versus 5I. That's hashtag 1 versus 5 letter I, and we are at 1versus5i.com. Tonight is a fundraising stream because I am suing the agencies who wrongfully targeted me for my activism and my journalism, and I would deeply appreciate you sharing the donate link, which you should see on the bottom of the screen right now. It's at 1versus5i.com/donate. Lissa, can you hear me fine?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. You sound great. Welcome to the stream.
Thank you for having me. Good to be here.
Last week was absolutely fantastic and I got so much positive feedback. We are working through these JTRIG documents because they enlighten us about the methods that are used to target people around the world by the intelligence agencies of the Western countries. In this specific case, the Joint Threat Research Intelligence Group, which is a unit of the GCHQ, which is the United Kingdom's NSA. So I'm going to screen share and we're going to pick up exactly where we left off last week in those documents and continue through from there. So hopefully you all now can see my screen and you will see this very messy slide that we worked through last week. We already covered off these first 2 columns. Was there anything you wanted to add, Lissa, before I move forward?
Just a couple of things. I think the slide we went through last week was the slide just before this with all these blue sort of thought bubbles on it. If you just, is it possible to scroll up a little bit?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, that's the slide we were on last week. And then if we go back down to these very busy slides. The next slide with and if we stop there. Like I said last week, we're kind of guessing exactly what the presenters were intending to get across, but my take on what's happening here is, the previous slides being presented, most of which we went through last week. We didn't go through the right-hand column, but, I think that's mainly about applying all of these theoretical principles in a fluid, elegant, creative way that draws on intuition as well as science, so that, influence agents who are, say, posing as an activist or trying to strike up a friendship, befriend someone, aren't coming across as wooden. Obviously, they want to seem natural. So I think that's what that's about, and combining science with intuition on the right-hand side. So on the left-hand side, it looks to me like they're layering over that psychological theory just some broader considerations for people. At the top, they're talking about mental health and psychopathy. Psychopathy is, what you suffer from if you're a psychopath. So I'm not 100% sure what they're talking about there. It doesn't really make sense. I think what they mean is mental health and psychopathology, which is essentially saying...
So they've got these 2 blue bubbles grouped around the individual. So it seems to me that when they're talking about mental health and psychopathy, they're assessing the target.
Yeah, it still wouldn't make sense to be assessing a target for psychopathy unless, I guess unless you're talking about pedophiles and, genuinely violent terrorists and criminals and so on. If you're talking about activists, it doesn't make sense. And psychopathy is actually very rare, so I'm not, it wouldn't be a smart thing to do to really focus on that by itself. My guess is, because there's a few things that look like typos and spelling mistakes in these slides, my guess is they mean psychological health and illness, or, you know, exploiting people's strengths and weaknesses.
So I know that one of the things that they do is they try to do IQ assessments on their targets, and they also try to do personality, like traditional personality type tests on the targets as well. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if they're also doing mental health assessments.
Yeah, it would make sense. Yeah. And also just, you know, you can exploit people's strengths as well as their weaknesses if you're talking about, as these slides are, talking about deceiving people and exploiting people, exploiting them psychologically. So, for instance, if someone's very altruistic, really likes to help, you know, very cooperative and giving, you could exploit that. And in fact, that persuasion, when you've got a group, there's a little box called persuasion there that we didn't talk about last time, which is actually probably quite critical. I mean, some of it is fleshed out in a subsequent slide. There are 6 principles of persuasion in the psychology literature put together by a fellow called Robert Cialdini, who's very well known in psychology. They reference him in a subsequent slide. And the 6 principles of persuasion are meant for marketing, but they're essentially tactics to get people to say yes to you. So if you're selling something, to get someone to say yes to your sales pitch, it's their tactics to basically increase the conformity and obedience and compliance that they talk about in these slides, and or as a way in to start up a relationship. So some of those 6 principles are things like exploiting reciprocity. So you do something for someone and people are more likely to say yes to someone that they feel they owe. So, and that would be particularly true of someone who is very responsible and kind of thoughtful and giving. So that'd be an example of exploiting somebody's, you know, psychological strengths. Or, you know, another of the persuasive principles is using authority, that people say yes to people who they perceive as credible experts. So, you know, hence intelligence agencies put a lot of effort into forming collaborations with journalists and academics and think tanks with credible sounding names. And if someone tends to be anxious, anxiety and fear goes along with obedience to authority. So that would sort of help people to work out which persuasive tactics might be most effective for someone.
And they've tied that here to decision making, rationale, choice, crime and punishment.
Yeah, I think that's another typo. They mean rational choice, not rationale choice. Rational choice theory is a theory of offending behaviour and economic behaviour, actually, and it doesn't have much credibility in psychology anymore because, as they say in that white box to the right, most decision making and behaviour is very emotion driven. Rational choice theory sees, say, criminal offending is driven by people rationally weighing up costs and benefits of their actions, which in reality isn't what drives most behaviour. But they do mention that in the supporting documents, and then they acknowledge that that's not what drives most people. So I'm not 100% sure why maybe it's in there to say that that's what we used to think, but we know that behaviour is not quite so rational. But if they were using that, they would want to, I guess, manipulate people's perceptions of the costs and benefits of taking a particular action. So if someone thought it's risky to do something that the influence agent was trying to get them to do, they would seek to alter their perception of, risks and costs and benefits of taking a particular behaviour.
Interesting.
So just coming back to persuasion, I guess it'll come up again in another slide. I think it's worth knowing about that because a lot of those tactics are about how to get in with somebody, how to start to build trust with somebody. So, I mentioned a couple, the reciprocity, and that would mean that, one way to sort of influence someone or befriend them, as these slides encourage people to do, would be to do something for them. Say if it's targeting a journalist, share their article or promote their article or offer them some information that they could use in an article. and then that will make them more open to influence, to saying yes to something that you ask of them. Another one of those 6 principles is what they call consistency, and that's the principle that people like to behave in ways that are consistent with what they've done before. So you start out by asking somebody to publicly do something small. In the experiments, the classic experiment is they go to people and say, will you put this great big sign on the front yard advertising whatever it is, the county fair? And people say, oh, no, I don't want that big sign on my front yard. Whereas if they start by saying, will you put this little plaque on your letterbox advertising the county fair? Oh, okay. And then after that's been there for a while, then if they come and ask them to put the big plaque on the lawn, or the big sign on the lawn, they'll say yes. So that's another sort of entry point or way of influencing, is to get somebody to do something small, like you write this article on election integrity, or you share this tweet, or you post this on your Facebook page, or something little. Then expanding that and working in, the real material that they want you to get on board with. So in this case, perhaps just, discrediting somebody, smearing somebody. And some of the other persuasion principles we've talked about, exploiting group norms, wanting to do what everybody else is doing. Likability, people will say yes to people that they like, making yourself likable by complimenting somebody or flattering them. We can talk about that more when we come to other slides, but I think those 6 principles of persuasion are useful to know about. I remember them by the acronym RASCAL. It's reciprocity, authority, scarcity, is people want what they don't have, compliance or conformity, which is the group, conforming to what you believe the group's doing, consistency, which is being consistent with what you've done in the past, so starting to ask you for something small and escalating it, and then likability, flattering you, inviting you to work towards a shared goal, reciprocal self-disclosure, that kind of thing.
Right, so down here in the other blue bubbles, new blue bubbles, we have morality and ethics, cyber cultures across organisations, legitimization of violence, which I have plenty to say about, tools and techniques, scientific methods for assessing MOEs, which would be what? Methods of?
I think that's either method of entry, which I was just kind of talking about, ways to get in with somebody, whether it's, by messaging them or emailing them or contacting them, or method of engagement, which I guess is similar.
Right. And then alias management and legend building, which they decided not to include in this specific training. Okay, so morality and ethics, they've got that, they're pulling that down from Hofstede dimensions, which we discussed last week.
I don't know if they're necessarily, well, maybe they're linking that to the Hofstede dimensions, which is cross-cultural differences, basically. When we come to...
Or maybe rather from the behaviour and influence they're pulling that down from.
When we go through the document that explains all of this, they talk about morality and ethics, and they basically say we don't have any ethical code to cover what we're doing here. So maybe that's a thought bubble about, to be determined. In the accompanying documents, they talk about psychological code of ethics, international law, legal codes of ethics, describe them briefly, and then say, of course, those psychological codes don't apply to what we're doing here in JTRIG, consistent with what we're doing, and they say that they need to develop a bespoke moral code or ethical code for JTRIG, which they didn't have at the time that they put this together, which is putting the cart before the horse. You're meant to have a moral, an ethical code before you start designing your programs.
Absolutely.
Rather than design your program and then come up with an ethical code that, incorporates it.
I did have a read through that document. There is startling discoveries in there, and I definitely want to cover that off with you separately. Just to take this back to the top, we're talking about online human intelligence, magic techniques, and experiment, which I think is a really key word that we haven't discussed yet, which is that I think a lot of what they're doing here is experimental. And they've got this under key skill strands. So my take on morality and ethics here is that it's the assessment of the individual target or of the
That
group,
could be.
that
Yeah,
they're
could be.
assessing the morality and the ethics that govern the behaviour and of the target or what may influence them, and that they're then looking to exploit those findings.
Yeah, that would make sense. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, you're probably
Cyber
right.
cultures
Yeah.
across organizations would again be partially an assessment in view of exploitation. I think everything in this document is about exploitation. I think basically that's what JTRIG is about, is exploitation.
Yeah, well, they use that word even throughout the slides, don't they? And the documents.
Yeah, sure. And also CNA, computer network attacks, they're about exploitation. This is a software development term, or certainly a hacking term, exploitation. But what they're doing here is they're exploiting individuals, and they're exploiting their personalities and their traits. So I think once they've determined morality and ethics, once they've determined the culture of an organization, that they are then looking to exploit that. Legitimization of violence I find really interesting. This is a key principle in human intelligence, particularly of infiltrators and saboteurs and movements. It's a long known and recognized attribute that they will push to legitimize violence within the organization, so that they can get arrests and accuse people of crimes and convict them of crimes, but more so that they can justify their own intrusion into the group in the first place. It's a self-justifying behavior is how I see it, because if they do not successfully achieve legitimization of violence within a target group, then it becomes very difficult for them to justify their targeting of the group. So I see legitimization of violence as an end goal. But however, you also see that this is down here by this global phase where they're talking about the global, their global aspirations, not just group or individual. And I think I'm just going to stop share for a second. I think that there's a conversation here to be had about the legitimization of violence at societal levels, and particularly post 9/11. And we see that legitimization of violence in a number of ways. So I was actually just watching Graham Elwood's channel. He was doing a live stream a short time ago, and he was talking about the Super Bowl and the Super Bowl advertising. And he talked about how Call of Duty, Modern Warfare, which is this very famous first-person shooter, so-called first-person shooter online video game, is running ads in the Super Bowl. And it's all like, killing is great, killing is grand, let's kill, 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 enemy, enemy, enemy. And then right on the back of those ads that are effectively glamorizing violence or depicting war as being like a video game where you can beat other people and achieve high scores, etc., and win and be victorious. On the back of that is the Marines recruiting advertising. So it's like creating that environment of legitimization of violence, and then the hook is to draw you into participating in real world violence. And I have seen the same thing both in activism and media spheres at scale in recent years. So when I think about legitimization of violence, I think about punch a Nazi, punch a Nazi. And, you know, you might have heard punch a Nazi from anti-fascist activists for decades. But where you didn't hear it from was blue tick mainstream media figures. Where you didn't hear it from was people who have major social accreditation or influence. And yet we have seen that in recent years. And in particular, from my perspective of activism, and actually Julian Assange tweeted out a video of an interview I did, and he timestamped a specific section that of me speaking, and where he timestamped and he said this is good was when I was talking about how in 2011 it was protesters versus the state, it was protesters versus riot cops, it was the people versus authority. And in recent years, I'd say particularly the last 4 to 5 years, that dynamic has changed, where it's now no longer protester against the state or protester against the riot police, it's protester against protester. And we see these opposing factions, civic factions, citizens against citizens, and citizens being encouraged to fight other citizens. And particularly in terms of protests, now one citizens group protests another citizens group. They don't protest the police, they don't protest the power structure, they don't protest the military, they protest each other. And both sides are encouraged to engage in violence, and have created an atmosphere of a legitimization of violence. Whereas we know that historically protest that has been successful has been non-violent protest by and large. And so I see the intelligence community provoking both sides of issues, infiltrating and sabotaging groups on both sides of issues, and legitimizing violence culturally and societally in order to encourage us to target each other instead of targeting the state. That's my take on the legitimization of violence.
And I guess what you're talking about there is marrying those group dynamics in the area of the slide that talks about social identity theory and groups. So that's exploiting that in a way that not only creates animosity between people, but creates legitimizes violence between the groups, which is quite shocking to think that a slide full of psychological knowledge and principles would be being used to that end openly. I mean, when I first saw that, I thought, surely they don't mean actually legitimizing violence by targets. Surely they're talking about violence being legitimized within the groups and communities that they're targeting. But I mean, what you're saying makes sense. So,
there's so many historical precedents for. I mean, you can go right back to the 60s and 70s and the FBI infiltration of the Black Panther movement, where they were pushing for the Black Panthers to be armed. They were actually supplying arms to the Black Panther movement. You can go to No NATO in Chicago more recently, 2012, I believe, where they were again trying to arm protesters, where they were supplying them with Molotov cocktails, where, there's a long history of particularly FBI, but certainly other agencies as well, supplying weaponry and pushing for violence and legitimizing violence. And I just see it as having become more and more rife, not just in those specific operations, but societally and culturally at scale. And you see it in the narrative and what and in what it's okay to say. Like 10 years ago, it wouldn't have been okay for major mainstream figures to be saying, yeah, just go and punch them, or just go and whatever, and sharing videos of people being punched and glorifying
open calls to assassinate Julian Assange. Many open calls to assassinate Julian Assange.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. That's yet another classic example of legitimization of violence. Just illegally shoot the son of a bitch. They said about Julian. And that person, that network isn't being censured. That person isn't being censured. There's no recourse, apparently, against them.
And these slides, the accompanying documents say these tactics are intended to apply from individuals to groups to populations to states and regimes. On the slides, they talk about targeting from the individual all the way down to mass media, and they talk about propaganda. So you're right, legitimization of violence is absolutely everywhere in the mass media. We legitimize bombing other countries as humanitarian intervention, saving populations from their own leader by bombing them and destroying their country. It makes no sense whatsoever. But most foreign policy, I think, news coverage is, about legitimizing the violence of war and sanctions, which is essentially siege warfare that kills people. So it's continually normalized and sanitized and rationalized and continually prompted to morally disengage from it. So
And
Yeah,
interestingly, I mean, I think it's fair to say that these documents are all about waging psychological violence on targets, and that internally within these agencies, they're constantly manufacturing ways to legitimize their own violence.
Yes, that's right. So perhaps that morality and ethics bubble refers to both, refers to the morality and ethics of legitimising violence, because, you know, it's just above that, and refers to the morality and ethics of the targets and of the groups that they're targeting.
Just sharing screen again. It also says under that tools and techniques, scientific methods for assessing MOEs. So the scientific methods would be the psychological principles.
Methods, yes, they're talking about methods of entry or methods of engagement. I'd imagine they're talking about the kind of personality assessment you were talking about, you know, the ocean up the top in green, which is the 5, you know, most widely recognised facets of personality. I assume that's what they're talking about. I mean, the accompanying document talks about the need to develop methods to use digital information and, you know, remote assessment in digital cues, they call it, to assess people's personality, which in 2011, I'm not sure how advanced that was. It's quite advanced now, thanks to Cambridge Analytica and its parent company, SCL, which has worked in concert with the same organisation that the psychologist who wrote these slides worked for, the Defence Science and Research Laboratory, I think they're called, or Technology Laboratory. So that's possibly what they're talking about there, assessing personalities in terms of your method of entry. Do you use authority? Is it so someone who was, say, high on conscientiousness and low on openness in the personality assessment, authority would be likely to be a good method of entry. Someone who was high on agreeableness and high on openness would, you know, be more amenable to the reciprocity. Someone, you know, high on neuroticism would be more amenable to a fear-inducing kind of method of engagement. So I'm guessing that's what they're talking about. Because, you know, I'm not sure what other scientific methods they'd be talking about in terms of assessment. A lot of the stuff here is about methods of persuasion and manipulation. So it's quite possibly what they mean.
Okay, I think we should move on.
So yeah. Just one thing here, maybe we can come to it later, but narrative, just under performance and near media, that probably refers to the fact that human decision making is, we make our decisions by constructing stories, and stories that fit with our pre-existing knowledge of the world, like we're a democracy and evil regimes are in the other part of the world, or, you know, whatever it is a very powerful way to influence what people think and what they believe. And another slide talks about providing, I think, partial stories, and people will fill in the gaps. So if you provide, you see that all the time in propaganda, that, you know, and in mainstream media, coverage of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks is a perfect example. Just tiny little bits are fed in. People don't really know what the story is. They fill it in with their sort of stereotypes and scripts and expectations. So I think that's what that's referring to.
And sure enough, that narratives section here says brainstorming, consider alternate perspectives, and intel analysis. Now, I see that as intel analysis being the foundation, and that plays in very much to here where I believe that they're actually assessing the individual. This is the analysis of the individual, and that's the foundation on which they brainstorm their narratives.
Makes sense, which fits in with conspiracy stories on the left under group.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so moving down, the human science learning path. This definitely looks like your field.
Yeah, although I kind of read that as just their plan of their kind of training modules and how they fit together. So it looks like the history, e-learning. I'm not sure exactly what history they're talking about there. Human aspects of cyber operations. I imagine we
Yeah,
all
look,
kind of
this is
stuff.
look, I find this very fascinating because they've actually included in here how long it takes someone to write. So the history, they're saying you can study that electronically. Then there's a 3-day course on the human aspects of cyber operations.
Which is probably the sort of stuff we've been talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. A
slide.
one day course on culture, assessing culture. A 2-week course on scams and deception.
Which is, I mean, the meat of that would be some of the persuasion, those rascal, those 6 principles. That's a big part of that. So they probably would go into a lot of detail about how to use authority, how to use reciprocity, how to, you know, make someone like you, etc.
2 weeks is 80 hours of learning.
So 80
hours of learning on deception and scams. And also in other Snowden documents, we learned that the NSA the CIA awards denial and deception awards to NSA employees, where they're actually awarded based on their successful denial and deception. Absolutely. They receive commendations for having successfully practiced deception.
Mike Pompeo recently boasted to an audience at a university that they had entire training courses on lying at the CIA. So I guess we're looking at one of those right now, aren't we?
Absolutely. Strategic influence, 1-day course. Psychology and cyber psychology, 1-day course. Digital tells, a half-day course, 4 hours on learning people's cues. 1 hour on disruption. And social engineering for computer network attacks is an e-learning course. So that says it all for me, that if you add up all of these training days for all of these other aspects, it's still not as long in duration as there's scams and deception. 2 weeks.
Yeah. So
really,
definitely what they're focusing on, isn't it?
You can learn to be a scumbag in less than 3 weeks. And just for good measure, there's a photograph of a tank to make you feel strong. Oh, look, it's men lifting a tank. We are strong. That's what that says. And we move into magic tricks. We are strong and we are magicians.
Strong magicians, military magicians.
Here we go. Magicians, the military and intelligence. 1856, mission on behalf of Napoleon III to help quell the Marabout-led uprising in Algeria. 1940s, camouflage work during the Second World War. 1950s, CIA work on the application of conjuring to clandestine activities.
Actually, John Mulholland wrote a book called The Manual of Trickery and Deception for the CIA in the 50s. You can buy it on Amazon. I think Amazon. And it's mainly about slipping, I think I said last time, slipping drugs into people's drinks and that kind of thing, sleight of hand type stuff. So it was less abstract than what we're talking about now. But I guess they're building on that history of using magicians.
Dissimulation, hiding the real, masking, mimicking, repackaging, inventing, dazzling, and decoying. So I guess I've read that wrong. It should really be masking, repackaging, dazzling, mimicking, inventing, and decoying.
I find that mimicking one really, it's creepy, but I'm reminded of that quite a lot actually on Twitter, navigating what goes on in, amongst Julian Assange supporters, and there'd be a real grassroots group, and then another group takes, just kind of mimics that grassroots group, and then starts sowing division, and or pretending to be somebody's friend, pretending to be another activist, using those principles of persuasion to befriend someone and find your way in. And that image I think is quite apt. So
I think there's a lot to break down in here, and actually we'll probably do it in the following slide, because I think the super interesting slide that, we're very close to it, there's one slide that I've wanted for years to go through, and it's this one here, Gambits for Deception. So I can't wait till we get to that. My thoughts on this: masking is obviously to hide the true motive or hide the true purpose. Repackaging is to dress it up as something else other than what it is. And actually, I got some feedback this week that people want to hear some more practical examples of this. There is definitely practical examples that I can give you for this. Repackaging something as other than what it is. This is, this is entirely what human intelligence do, right? Because they mask themselves, they mask their true identity, they mask their true purpose, they mask their true motive. They repackage themselves as one of the crowd, one of the group, one of the movement. But they also repackage their endeavors as being something other than they are. And dazzling, it ties in with that next thing. Dazzling is all about grabbing and controlling the attention of the group. So let me think about some examples from Occupy movement. We had a saboteur in the movement. He and key others who we manipulated. We would have an event that the movement had sanctioned. It would be several months in the planning. Everybody knew it would happen. It was expected it would be on a global solidarity day. He and his group would argue that our larger group action would be ineffective, and therefore at the last possible moment they would want to do something spectacular that would undercut and undermine the larger group's plan, which of course was our group's plan. The larger group's plan was in coordination with the global movement. These guys would just try and run roughshod over the top. And they would do something, also legitimization of violence ties into it. They would do something really dazzling to grab everybody's attention and divert them from the planning of what we should be doing. For example, they would decide that they wanted to go and smash down the fences that the council had put up. And they would work in concert with mainstream media. They would hold fake press conferences, and then they would have the media capture these images of them doing violent things, smashing down the fences, whatever, so that the media would then portray the movement in a negative light. And they would do it, and then they would try to use those things to build credibility with themselves. Like, look, we're so effective, we got media coverage, even though the media coverage is extremely negative for the movement. They very much about dazzling, very much about repackaging an action as being about something else. Just look at the second row of those, because I think that feeds into it as well. Mimicking, inventing. Right, so that's another thing that they would do at Occupy. The saboteurs would create fake versions of our official materials and then circulate them as widely as possible. So they would create a fake Occupy Auckland website, which was not the actual Occupy Auckland website, and a fake Occupy Auckland Facebook page, which is not the actual, like our Occupy Auckland Facebook page would have 6,000 likes. Their one would have like 200 likes. And then they would create business cards and posters and flyers and put the link to the fake website and the fake YouTube channel and the fake Facebook page and print thousands of flyers and stand on Queen Street and give them out to like thousands of people, so that they're then going and looking at these like crappy half-baked fake social media accounts and then thinking that those are the real ones and then interacting with them. They would even have fake email addresses, so now members of the public who are wanting to support would be contacting the saboteurs instead of contacting the actual approved movement communications channels. It all ties in directly to this mimicking and this repackaging and this masking, very much so. I mean,
And
I have 8 years of stories that I could go through, but that's just one example I can think of off the top of my head, which is very highly coordinated and very planned. Like the man hours involved in actually going and setting up all these fake communications channels and the resources required to doing all the printing, and then the oh god, they even would set up entire fake occupations, and fake press releases, fake the whole 9 yards. It was just absolutely, the lengths that they go to are almost impressive, except that they are so underhanded and nefarious and so toxic and poisonous, because surrounding this you have so many genuine good people who really care about the movement, who are just befuddled by watching this unfold. Because, I mean, this very much happened for me during Occupy. I was so green as an activist. I had no idea that there were teams of saboteurs that would do this stuff. So I would see these actions and I would think, why is he doing that? Why is she doing that? Why? And I'd try and work out, like, is it some personality issue? Is it some whatever? And then as a group, the group's method of trying to resolve this would be to have conflict resolution meetings. So now we've got the fake saboteurs in with the good people having these endless discussions week in and week out about who did what, who whatever, who chose whatever, who said whatever, who thought whatever, and nothing ever comes of it, because with saboteurs you can sit there and talk until you're blue in the face. You're never going to, they just work in circles, right? So you never actually progress with them. And by directly engaging with them in that way, they actually get what they want, because they have your attention. They're consuming your attention. They're consuming your time and your resources. So it's a win for them. But we were all just sitting there like, why would anyone do this? This doesn't make sense. Like, we have agreed processes and they're ignoring them, and et cetera, et cetera. And but as you continue from movement to movement, what I saw was exactly the same patterns played out. At each movement, each year we'd have a new movement, a new issue, and the same, in some cases exactly the same people, but more importantly, the same methods. The same methods being employed, achieving the same results, the same types of people being targeted, the most proficient, most intelligent, most committed people being targeted and undermined and smeared, the least effective people being raised up and then manipulated, and the saboteurs commanding everybody's attention, dazzling them, mask, exactly as the screen says. I mean, this screen is basically the saboteurs' code of conduct: masking, repackaging, dazzling, mimicking, inventing, and decoying.
Well, everything you just described, I see going on in smaller ways amongst WikiLeaks activism community and supporters who are working to free Julian Assange. The mimicking and the decoying and the dramas and the turning, creating divisions and turning sub-factions against each other and so on. All efforts to do that anyway. So, everything you talked about, I could think of a parallel.
I mean, I can give you there are many WikiLeaks examples. So there's the WikiLeaks forum. The WikiLeaks forum was started as a place where WikiLeaks supporters could talk to each other and could coordinate with each other and could support and promote WikiLeaks, except that it was the proprietor, for want of a better term, turned out to be an FBI-affiliated UK intelligence asset who turned the WikiLeaks, after he collected a large number of WikiLeaks supporters in one place, used the WikiLeaks forum to discredit major supporters who are legitimate, well-known, productive activists, but more importantly, to ideologically attack WikiLeaks as an organisation and to deter supporters from supporting them. He picked off those idealists and those realist people, supporters that would fall into those categories, disillusioning them about WikiLeaks and its non-adherence to its mission or its overzealous adherence to its mission, take your pick. and eventually just creating what started as a support forum became a collection of hundreds of blog posts about how terrible WikiLeaks and Julian Assange is and why we should all oppose them, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's all about that masking, that repackaging, that mimicking. They establish credibility as a supporter so that when they take their support away, when they withdraw their support, it becomes more effective.
Yeah, and anybody watching this who wants to resist that, I mean, one of the most, pervasively manipulable qualities of human beings is our group-based psychology. And even talking about this now, since last week, I've seen people getting attacked within the WikiLeaks community as being a CIA asset, people who clearly aren't. So even us talking about this, I think we need to be careful not to get into an us versus them mindset, even just activists versus intelligence agencies, because that can be exploited by pointing the finger at people and saying, oh, they're an infiltrator, or they're an influence agent.
This is why,
and then that feeds the mistrust.
Yeah, this is why I always said this is the number one thing that I've learned, and this is what I learned from those many weeks and months of our whole group being embroiled in these conflict resolution processes, is that even if someone is a saboteur, even if they are an informant, even if they are on payroll and they've been assigned to come and destroy your group, the time that you spend engaging with them and others, trying to explain and sort through whether they are or aren't, and trying to dig up and research and whatever else, and trying to prove it, trying to work out an effective strategy for dealing with it, you've just lost 3 months, 6 months, 12 months of activism time. Even that process in some ways serves the agencies, because they don't care. When they will hold on until the last bitter moment, and then they would have insinuated more people to perform the same task anyway. So I learned long ago that you don't assess the personality, you don't assess the individual, because they're replaceable like that. You just assess the methodology. And that's exactly what this entire series is about, is assessing the methodology, because they're just like they say that people have digital towels. These intelligence agencies have digital towels. They have real world towels as well. You can tell who they are and what they're doing, regardless of whether their name is Tom, Dick, or Harry. And once you learn to spot those methods, you can go around them. You can work around them. And you can be much more effective as an activist. And you save yourself the emotional trauma of having to deal with these people. You actually, you are rewarded with the fullness of your time and being able to better achieve your goals by sidestepping these people.
And staying focused on the overall objective, don't you think? And because if you fall into, is somebody an intelligence agent? Are we being infiltrated? And always on the lookout for that. Well, then you're being mistrustful. And if you see it everywhere, then you're denying yourself the ability to form bonds with, other people who are genuinely on the same page as you. And then that's a win as well. If people came away from, say, this series being mistrustful and seeing infiltrators everywhere and having an us versus them mindset,
well,
it's important to step aside from that.
And I agree with you entirely. In the case of WikiLeaks, we don't have to ask, are there agents, are there whatever? I mean, they announced it in 2010. There's a Pentagon manhunt for Julian. Like, we know this. They told us they're going after the organization. They've told us time and time and time again. So you can assume by default, absolutely there are, and there will be infiltrators from a whole range of agencies. There's from the intelligence agencies, there's subcontractors, there's private intelligence companies that want to get information out of the movement so that they can go and sell it to the intelligence companies. That's how they work. They literally create spreadsheets and then go and sell the data to the intelligence agency. So yes, it's happening, but we don't need to obsess over who.
I guess I'm saying
incident.
I'm saying a good way to resist it, I think, is to really resist any us versus them mindset, whether it's us versus intelligence agencies, newcomers versus old hats, left versus right, people versus lawyers. I mean, there's just so many lines along which you see constantly efforts to fracture. And if you ever find yourself falling into an us versus them kind of mentality, I'm encouraged to step aside from it, because that's probably the most readily exploitable and the most readily sort of activated human vulnerability that we have.
So what I've seen in activism movements is that every group starts with an outward focus and an outward objective. The world is in crisis. Why? Because of the banks, because of economic inequality. We want to do something about that. We're going to take action. We're going to this, that, or the other. It's an outward focus, and the whole group shares that focus. That's what's brought the group together. What infiltrators and saboteurs and intelligence agencies do is try to take that outward focus and turn it inwards. So all of a sudden, you're not talking about the banks, you're not talking about economic inequality. You're talking about, did Tom, Dick, or Sally say whatever to who, or should have done that, should have said that, should have whatever, or why didn't they this, why didn't they that? That's the point at which the intelligence agencies are winning. Is that you're not talking about your issue, you're not talking about what you're going to do about that issue, you're now talking about each other.
Exactly. Yep. So get above the mosh pit and get out of the us versus them mudslinging. Yeah.
I think it can be as simple. Yeah. It can be as simple as remembering what brought you in the first place.
Exactly. Yeah.
And keeping that in mind. Okay, let's move back on through the slides. The psychological building blocks of deception. Bearing in mind that this is a 2-week course. Component of this course, how to deceive people. This is one for you to talk us through for sure.
Yeah, in some ways, they've started with the detail and then come back to the big picture, and I'm not really sure why they did it in that order. But this, they're framing all of this as being, building cyber magicians or training cyber magicians. And these boxes and arrows really draw from the literature on magic tricks and perceptual illusions, which are all about manipulating people's perception of what they see. So perhaps a simple way to illustrate this is the magic trick where people think they see a ball disappear midair. And obviously intelligence agencies are trying to get people to, to see things they want them to see that are more complex and more social things, but this sort of framework we're obviously using. So it's built on the principle, research into magic tricks and perceptual illusions tells us that we see what we expect to see, and what we see depends on sort of where our attention is directed. So, for example, there's a magic trick where you throw a ball in the air repeatedly, and on a certain throw, say it's the third throw, you drop the ball in your pocket. Well, throwing the ball in the air creates the expectancy that the ball is going to leave the magician's hand. And because people expect to see the ball go up in the air, their visual system fills in the blanks for a few seconds and they actually see the ball leave the magician's hand. And then their brain catches up and they realise the ball's not there. And so there's this illusion of the ball disappearing midair, and really people really experience it as magic. And to make that happen, people who fall for that trick, their attention needs to be directed by the magician upwards from the hand. So if people are following the magician's eye, if the magician looks up and people follow his gaze, that feeds into the trick. A subsequent slide says the target will look where you look. That's what that's about, I think. And then that influences their perception. So what you're expecting and what you're focusing on influences what you perceive and the sense that you make of it. Psychologists divide perception into, selection, which is what you're attending to, how you organise what you see, and how you interpret it or how you make sense of it. So because you were manipulated such that your expectancies and your attention made you think, see the ball and then you couldn't, you think, oh, what happened? Wow, the ball disappeared. That's the sense you make of it. This guy's amazing. Affect is emotion, so that feeds into the sense that you make of it. So if you're sitting in the audience thinking, this magician's incredible, you're more likely to fall for the illusion. If you're sitting back bored, not really engaged, your attention's not really invested, you'll be less likely to fall for it. So behaviour in that case is just you clap and you're willing to pay for the show. So, I kind of see Russiagate in these terms. People's expectancies are that they live in a democracy. Their expectancies from the Cold War about Russia. attention is distracted by constant decoying and distracting and breaking bombshells, which means that people's perception of what happened in 2016, their affect is that they're shocked and they're angry, so they're very primed because of these expectancies and the direction of their attention away from problems within their own society and towards the foreign evildoer. The sense is, wow, we got hacked by, American democracy got hacked by Russia. So the behaviour is we'll submit to all sorts of censorship and crackdowns on our democratic rights and freedoms to protect us from the foreign evildoers. So the previous slides were basically about manipulating people's affect, their emotions, to get them to make the sense that you want to make of things, manipulating their perception, grabbing their attention. It's interesting they've got the whole world. They're obviously wanting to grab attention from all over the world. So it's kind of an umbrella framework, I think, for how all these other more detailed tactics and psychological principles feed in.
And so what you see with Russiagate in terms of behavioural outcomes and effect is that as they recruit people into the lie, they're effectively deputising them to perpetuate it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. And, this is talking about discrediting and disrupting. Well, that's been used to discredit so many people. Jeremy Corbyn, Julian Assange, all independent media, basically anyone who has a different opinion to the officially anointed narrative on things. So you're right. It's that's targeting populations to become sort of agents of the discreditation and the disruption.
Okay, so moving along. Aha! Map of technologies to message delivery. This is incredibly fascinating, and this might be one for me to speak to. So, giving a real world example here, 4 times in my activism, I have had what could be termed an e-stalker, but these e-stalkers follow very specific methodologies that mirror each other perfectly. The reason there's 4 of them is because I've been in activism for 8 years, and they don't seem to be able to sustain one e-stalker for long periods of time, and eventually their material becomes stale and old, and they need new blood to come in and perpetuate it. Now, I'll speak to my most recent e-stalker. My most recent e-stalker is somebody who claims to be a member of my political party. I say claims to because no one's ever actually met them, and we can't verify really that they even exist. However, they have repeated the method of attacking myself and the party that we've seen with my previous 3 e-stalkers across the years. So what they do is they create a narrative, and then they publish that narrative, and then they take their links to that published narrative and they perpetuate them, they spread them across all of these channels. So you see here the web pages, the blogging, right? So they make, God, we can probably even go and have a look at it if you would like to. They have created a website where they have not one, but something in the order of 14 articles so far that they've published just in the last 6 months about me, claiming the most absurd and insane imaginable things about me that are completely false. And then they take those links to those web pages and they mass email them to every single person I am in contact with, like am publicly known to be in contact with, that is in any way related to my life. They send them to the entire New Zealand mainstream media. I've received copies of these emails back from members of the media who instantly identified them as being smear attempts. They create dedicated Twitter and Facebook accounts. Sometimes they create fake, like I've had fake Facebook profiles created using my photos, but then posting completely false information about me. let me have a look and find some examples for you. Actually, I'm not sure if I have the screenshots on hand, but there was a Facebook account created in my name as if it was me, born in New Zealand, from Auckland, photos of me, links to my work, but it said that I studied at some Russian university. I studied like nuclear science at some Russian university. I was a graduate of some Russian university, which is completely false. I've never studied at any Russian university. And they'll put other factors in there to make it, highly suspicious and dodgy things, but then weave it in with real facts about me and real pieces of information about me. And then they'll take that link to that Facebook profile and they'll show that to people who are so, oh, did you know that she graduated nuclear technology at a Russian university, this type of thing. They created a Twitter account about me in the name of this supposed person, and the Twitter account is just top to bottom them sending their links to their smear blog posts, tagging hundreds, if not thousands of people. And actually in the JTRIG documents, it talks about mass messaging and mass tagging, and we'll get to that further down the documents. And that's exactly what they do. So they'll go back through my entire Twitter history. They'll see every person I've communicated with. They'll make these lists of all of my contacts, and then they'll tag in every single one of those people. With Unity4J, when Unity4J was being smeared and attacked last year, they would email all 90 of the guests who had appeared on the program with smears claiming that we're neo-Nazi, white supremacists, fascists, whatevers. They would target any person who retweeted Unity4J. Their handle would go on that list, and they would be sent the smear posts about us. They post on LinkedIn, exactly as it says here, all of these platforms. These are the platforms. And then they attempt to launder. I've noticed that there's a process. I actually would like to create a slide for it myself. So what they do is they create these bullshit smear blog posts, like I've said, and then they take those smear posts and they send them to alternative or independent journalists who they know have had some past beef with me or who don't like me or my work, and they attempt to launder the bullshit smears into the alternate media, the independent media. You see this with WikiLeaks and Julian as well. And then once they have a link to someone else who's picked up on the smears and published them, then they'll swap and they'll take those links from that person's work and they'll circulate that across everybody into all the contacts and everything, attempting to launder it into the mainstream. So it goes from disinfo agent to independent alternative media to mainstream media. Now, if they successfully push those smears, I believe launder is the correct word from my perspective, if they successfully launder those smear narratives into the mainstream media, their next step is that they will create a Wikipedia page about you. And they will take the links from the mainstream media and use them as the basis for the Wikipedia. Once they've done that, once they've achieved that final step, then they now have an official history of you. And that, I'll give you another great example, actually, a very good example with Internet Party.
Just before you do, can I just jump in?
Sure.
What you were just talking about there fits in with the persuasion principle of authority. The idea is before you make an influence attempt, you either establish your own credibility and expertise or you get someone else to do it for you, someone else with credibility and expertise and respect and authority. And it sounds like that's part of that strategy, is to get someone else to promote the smear with authority and credibility to the extent that it can make its way into the mainstream media and a Wikipedia page.
Absolutely. And maybe I should save my next example for a bit later, because the next example ties into the fake victim, where they'll claim to be a victim of you, use that as the basis for the smears, and then perpetuate the smears. And it also actually ties into that masking and repackaging as well, because we know now for a fact, it's proven, that Internet Party, we know it from the 2018 State Services Commission report in New Zealand, that Internet Party, my political party, was a target during our election campaigns of private intelligence companies and who were infiltrating and sabotaging. So there are some great examples I can give you there where they have successfully traversed that full process and laundered smear information into the public record in such a way that it's now considered to be established history of the party that can be referenced by anyone at any point, but it is completely false and was specifically manufactured to achieve those aims. But this is a great slide for showing this is how holistic it is. And this, when I talk about the methodology, and recognizing a methodology that's employed. Okay, if I have a problem with someone, a like serious problem with them, maybe I'll write a tweet. Maybe I would write something in a blog post. But what I would never do is spend 40 hours a week campaigning against this person on 10 different platforms and creating dedicated accounts and contacting every person in their life and doing everything I could to destroy them. Okay, that's the difference between someone who has a genuine issue and is genuinely disaffected, because people have personality conflicts all the time, and someone who is an actual disinfo operative who is being employed to attack a target. Their behavior and their conduct and the way they do what they do is completely indefensible by any rational means. There is, in fact, no other rational explanation than that they've been employed to specifically do that, because there is simply no sane person on the planet who would engage in such behaviors or who would be so vociferous about it.
So speaking of Wikipedia, I think some people did that. They calculated how much time it would take someone who was supposedly an individual to do all the edits that they were doing.
Correct.
And it was
Philip Cross.
more than the waking hours any individual would have available to them.
Exactly. And when someone is producing smear content on a scale that would literally require 40 hours a week to perpetuate it, then that tells you a lot about that person, if that person does in fact exist, which I think in many cases they actually don't. Not in the sense of the identity that they put forward as being themselves.
No. Yeah, well, these slides talk a lot about creating aliases, don't they? So
yeah, absolutely.
Part of what they do.
So this is why I see news media as being put in the background to this. So what I see here is that the foreground is the activity of the disinfo agent, and that the news media is almost like the final. They have here. Okay, so they've got now being the immediate harassment, soon as being the social media platforms and the propagation, and this being the forever. And that's another, it's interesting that they use time as a measure for it. I saw it as a process from bottom to top, bottom being this nobody smear blogger that may not even exist, to the independent alternate sphere, to the news media, to the Wikipedia. But see, this forever, this is really interesting that this is exactly what I'm trying to describe, where they create a permanent history. They're manufacturing a permanent history. And I think I demonstrated that pretty well in terms of WikiLeaks when I wrote Being Julian Assange, which was a huge study that I did about the history, the living history of WikiLeaks. And I went right through their Wikipedia page and the manufactured history that's been written about WikiLeaks. And then I went right back through all the original social media posts and showed that the actual history of WikiLeaks does not match the manufactured history and the manufactured narratives about WikiLeaks.
No, absolutely doesn't. Pulls apart.
And I mean, you see that too. Daniel Domscheit-Berg and Julian Assange. Daniel Domscheit-Berg says Julian Assange tortured my cat when he stayed at my house. Daniel Domscheit-Berg writes a book saying Julian tortured my cat. So the narrative becomes now a document. Somebody buys the rights to the books to make a movie. Oh, Julian Assange tortured his cat. Wikipedia can cite the movie and transcripts, So this is the thing. It starts as a low-level slur, and then it becomes documented, and then the standard of the document escalates, and then eventually it becomes an accepted history, which is cited and referred to by everybody. Oh yes, Julian's a cat torturer. Classic example. Okay, moving along. Attention management. Can you tell me anything about those photos? It looks here like you can't see the snake because the snake is faded, and oh god, that's creepy. That looks like, I want to say, is it a copy? No, a copy or something, some type of snake.
Is there a snake? I never saw it.
That is a snake. That is a snake. Those are the eyes of the snake and the nose of the snake.
Oh, I saw a moth. Wow, there you go. Yes. Okay.
No.
I looked at that slide and never saw a snake. I saw a moth. Right. Well, some of the subsequent slides will explain that. They talk about perception and cues and managing the cues. They talk a fair bit about that. So, and there's some other images further down. So, that's what perception is like. If you came at that primed with the cue of moth or, flight or wings, you'd see a moth. If you came to it primed with the cue of a snake or reptiles, you'd see a snake. So that's
or it's just the bark of a tree and it's not meant to be anything.
Yeah. And I think the other one, when you know that that's a building, you can see the building. Well, it's obvious that it's a building in front of a rock face. But if you couldn't see the bottom of the building, it would just look like a rock face. So it's about managing which part of a picture people are looking at. If you prevent them from seeing the whole picture, you can get them to see what you want to see, I think is what that's saying.
And there's the magician.
Yeah. I think that's just linking it back to magic tricks. So this is another example of that moth and the importance of cues and, perceptual framing. So, if you come at that thinking of birds primed with, flight and ducks and birds, you'd see a bird with a beak to the left. If you came to it primed with rabbits, Easter, whatever, you'd see a rabbit with the ears off to the left, rabbit facing to the right. So yeah, that
it's very much what you discussed already.
Exactly. Yep.
Spot on with what you discussed already. And I guess they expect that there is water beneath.
Yeah.
Aha, this slide. Okay, this slide has fascinated me for years, ever since I saw it. But a lot of this slide doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever, except this. And the fact that they put this top left on the slide said so much to me, that this is the priority.
Yeah, exactly. Well, if they're drawing on magic tricks, attention is absolutely everything. If you can manipulate people's attention. We only consciously process a tiny fraction of what comes in through our senses and into our brain. I think it's 1/250,000th of what is coming in are we consciously aware of. So, in magic tricks, if you or just perceptual tricks, they'll study eye movements. They can see exactly where people are looking. If you have a whole room of people running around and they're throwing a ball around and whatever, if you say to someone, look, count how many times that ball gets passed from person to person, that's where the person's attention is. Then a woman runs across dressed in a gorilla suit, waves at the camera, runs off. Even if people are looking straight at her, they don't see her because their attention is on counting the number of ball tosses, literally blind to the woman in the gorilla suit. So, so that's why that's up top. And so they talk about different ways of manipulating attention. So conspicuity and expectancies, that relates back to what we said before. People expect, or, see and attend to what they expect. I'm just going back to Russiagate. People expect that we're in a democracy and some foreign evildoers attacking us. So that's an expectancy that's very easy to tug on. It's almost sort of hardwired into, Western populations' brains. And if something's conspicuous, you'll attend to it. So, Russiagate bombshells or the sort of dramas that you're talking about. Then the big move covers the little move. That's like the magician waving the big colourful scarf, while the real move is dropping something into the pocket or setting something up for the next trick. So, in Russiagate, all of these breaking bombshells, those big moves promising impeachment, etc., covers the ongoing little moves of censorship and all these censorship tools being rolled out and smearing independent media as, a Russian plot, and along with that, passing legislation, at least in Australia, that essentially criminalises journalism under cover of countering foreign interference. So that's one sort of application, I guess, of that. The target looks where you look. That was the throwing the ball in the air example that I talked about. Russiagate was an example of that, or the smearing of Jeremy Corbyn, which we know was linked to the Integrity Initiative, which has, Ministry of Defence funding and ties to military intelligence, and their Twitter feed smearing Jeremy Corbyn. We know there were Electronic Intifada exposed 10 fake Twitter accounts pretending to be anti-Semitic Labor members. So you've got everybody looking at these smears against Jeremy Corbyn rather than his policies and how they benefit people or whatever, evaluating them, etc., compared to Tory policies. So that's an example of that. Attention drops at the perceived end means that when you think something's about to finish, you relax your attention. That's used in magic tricks so that you don't see the secret move. People do it they'll set up the expectation that, we're just doing one trick or doing this, little piece that's actually not where the real action is. But at the moment that people think that segment's coming to an end, that's the time where you do your secret move. And repetition reduces vigilance. If you do something over and over again, the attention becomes relaxed. People are less on the lookout for what the secret move is, like throwing the ball in the air. People just over and over, people just expect that's what's going to happen. They're not looking for a secret move. Again, Russiagate, oh my God, endless repetition for 2 years. So people become less kind of suspicious of what's going on behind the scenes of another investigation. What's this really about? I don't know if you have any sort of examples that come to your mind that are more about activism rather than
propaganda. Sure. So I have 100 different examples for people, looking to control attention. The big move covers the little move. I'd actually look to geopolitics at the moment. So the big move is, we are leaving Syria. We have left these bases. And the little move is, actually we're setting up a base over here because now we're going to get the oil. We're going to control the oil.
Yeah.
And how do we get from we're leaving Syria to we're now setting up new bases and controlling the oil? Well, nobody knows because we're still back at, we're leaving Afghanistan. No, except we're actually still in Afghanistan. So, and the target looks where you look. I mean, same thing. Like, we're leaving Syria. Oh my God! Every single talk show, politics talk show on cable news is having a fit about us leaving Syria, and everybody's looking at that. And how can Trump do this and that? And in the meantime, Trump's not doing anything like that whatsoever.
Yeah, same with the latest impeachment saga. People are looking at that rather than looking at the similarities between Democrats and Republicans, and that they're on the same page with most policies of significance, and that people who are genuinely offering different policies are smeared and locked out, and the whole process in various ways. So in some ways, mainstream news is an endless exercise in the target looks where you look.
Absolutely.
And sleights of hand going on, The thing about attention, it's really like a mental spotlight. If your attention isn't on something, you just don't see it, you don't recognise it, you might as well be blind to it. So,
sure, and repetition reduces vigilance. It's got to be the Russiagate in 3 words.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and all, actually, I'd say all pro-war propaganda, this repetitive bombardment with, so-and-so's a butcher or harming their own people, or, so that you're not looking at what else is this really about, like oil.
I'm thinking that attention drops at the perceived end actually applies really well to some of the fights that we've engaged in New Zealand. For example, the GCSB movement, massive nationwide movement, took 8 months initially to break into the mainstream, 2 years in duration, trying to fight against the passage of the GCSB bill. We lose the fight by 1 vote. The bill passes through Parliament, and everybody goes, "Oh, we've lost. That's the end." Now, rationally, the bill passing through Parliament shouldn't have been the end of that fight, but the messaging was, oh well, it's in, because this is 2013, the bill passes, oh well, 2014 is an election year, so actually if we just go and vote Labour, then Labour will come in and fix everything will be fine, and goodbye GCSB movement, 2 years of work goes down the toilet.
That's a good example, yeah. Or passing legislation at the end of the year, just before Christmas, like the NDAA. People aren't paying attention, pass some really alarming revisions that allow attention without trial and charge.
And repetition reduces vigilance, I think, is also 3 words that sums up the entire electoral cycle.
Yeah, that's true too.
What are we told when the election doesn't go right? Oh well, we've got another one in 4 years.
Yeah, true.
Back on the carousel. Okay, let's talk about perception here. This is definitely for you.
Yeah, I mean, so psychologists do break perception down into all these components. And the idea is, well, with perceptual illusions, you can give people some confusing visual data, and what they see in that data depends on how you frame it, the cues that you offer to guide what they attend to, what sense they make of it. So mask, mimic, I think what they're talking about there is the sort of stuff we've talked about already, in that they're wanting their actions to blend into the general landscape, whether it's the media landscape or the activism landscape, so that they're not standing out in your perception, that they're just part of the whole array that's in front of you. That's what I make of that. And then repackage, invent, modify old cues, create new cues. So the cues are what's directing how you make sense of what's in front of you. When I look at that, I think of the switch from Islamic terrorism as the foreign bogeyman to Russia as the foreign bogeyman. So that's sort of repackaging the cue that allows us to, that encourages Western populations to see a foreign bogeyman behind all ills. And when it turned out the West was arming and funding and training Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria, suddenly it was that switcheroo to Russia. No, it's not terrorism anymore. It's Russia that's the foreign bogeyman that's going to be the cue that allows us to make sense of everything in terms of increasing national security, increasing curtailment of, democratic rights and freedoms and so on. That's one example, I think, of that. Dazzling and decoying, blur old cues, create alternate cues. I think that's building on the previous slide. They were talking about changing the cues, shifting the cues, and I think they're saying dazzling and decoying being a way to do that. That certainly happened with that shift from terrorism to Russia as the foreign bogeyman, and the 2016 election was a perfect opportunity. The previous slide, it talks about emotion and affect feeding into what people are willing and able to perceive. And there was so much sort of shock, at least amongst Democrat voters and a certain segment of the population, shock and anger and just confusion about, a reality TV show host suddenly being president. That was perfect opportunity to create this dazzling, decoying, Russiagate, Putin puppet kind of, distraction or decoy to blur the cues from terrorism to Russia as the foreign, adversary of the day. Make the cue dynamic. People look at things that are obviously colourful, that move, that are changing. That's how to keep people's attention. So it's one thing getting attention, but maintaining attention. So you want to keep people's attention on the cue that's directing their perception, like the Russiagate cue. So that endless, shifting stream of bombshells and breaking news and promises of impeachment, and was a way of framing all these emails and meetings and this and that, and to the point where someone just had to talk to somebody Russian for it to be a scandal. And all along the way, another way of modifying old cues along there, it started with Russian collusion, then it was Russian interference, then it was Russian meddling, so sort of blurring the cue along the way, so that basically any conversation with a Russian doesn't have to be collusion with the Russian government, just has to be talking to a Russian person, and that's enough to provide a cue to make people see, a Russian threat in pretty much everything. Stimulate multiple sensors. I think they mean senses, like sight, sound, smell. A sensor is a mechanical thing, I'm pretty sure. With perception, they'd be talking about our sensory perceptive apparatus. So in the accompanying document, they talk about posting fake videos as well as fake blog sites, as well as messaging people. So, that's the best way to get through to people is, stimulating them on multiple levels, not just verbal messaging. So that's what I make of that line. Do you have anything to add, Susie?
Yeah, so I think absolutely right in terms of global narrative impact and societal influence, creating societal influence. However, all of this has very personal, targeted at an individual versions, the masking and mimicking. It's almost hard for me to talk about some of this stuff actually, because it's it's actually genuinely quite triggering. But what I see on this screen in particular is a bunch of things that I've personally been subjected to and that have been used against me personally over a protracted period of time. And also that I know for a fact have been used against other targets. Masking and mimicking is like that method of I'm now forgetting the MOEs. Like this is how they get in.
Method of engagement.
This is the interview, but it's also mimicry was also used to let you know that you are being targeted. For example, being out followed around on the ground. Actually, it happened to vehicles as well. Vehicles that are telling you, or people that are telling you on the ground, following you around, will do some gesture that you will understand, that other people won't understand, but you will understand, because that gesture means something to you, or it's a gesture that they have done multiple other times. So you'll be in completely disparate locations, disparate times, but the same gesture will be used to let you know this is being targeted at you. This is a message for you. No one else will understand it but you. And it's something innocuous enough that you can't do anything about it. It's not something you can go and say, this is happening to me, they're doing this to me, but they just do it again and again and again and again. And it's to make you experience that isolation, to make you feel like you're in this crazy world where these crazy people are doing this to you and what the hell's going on. And also it becomes a trigger, so that every time you see it, you're, oh, it's happening to me again. They're doing it again. And they'll have even different people do it, but they'll do the same thing. And usually it will relate to some aspect of either some interaction that you've had in your life, which they'll then repeat over and over again with these total strangers imposing this upon you, or some topic which is in some way concerning or upsetting to you. So there are women who've lost children that are constantly being provoked about children and babies. There are people who have certain injuries or certain health issues, which these total strangers who are tailing them will do something to trigger in some way, shape or form. yeah, I don't want to get into too many specific examples on that front for me personally, but that's something I experienced over and over again. They also do it with language. So they'll take something that you said in a private space where you being under surveillance is the only explanation for how they could have even found out about it. And then they'll come and sit next to you in a restaurant and say that exact phrase. And then you'll be walking down the street and someone will be on the phone saying that exact phrase. And then you'll, go to somewhere else in some other social situation, and they'll come and stand next to you and say that exact phrase. And again, they'll do this over and over again as a triggering message, and to provoke you. To provoke you and to negatively impact you. And so when I see this stuff here about cues, modifying cues, and also the repetition,
to create the perception that you're surrounded by people who are.
Yeah. So in terms of attention, it says repetition reduces vigilance, but here under sense making, in the next line, which we haven't discussed yet, it says repetition creates expectancies. And so repetition is actually weaponized in that way. For me, by 2014, when there was actual serious attempts to harm me, those attempts were in between the physical attempts to harm me. There was a whole lot of psychological stuff that would relate directly to the physical attempts to harm me. So they would create these serial killer profiles with little, like, fake social media profiles with photos of serial killers. And they would send me videos of people dying or people being killed. When I finally planned to leave New Zealand and booked plane tickets, they started sending me over and over again videos and photos of plane crash victims, of planes crashing, of people being news items about people being killed in plane crashes, emails threatening, many death threats. It was like this ongoing pattern. When I'd made a FOIA request to the New Zealand police about them utilising private companies for deployment of drones, they finally came back to me. My suspicions were correct. They had, in fact, been outsourcing police drone operations in New Zealand. But in the FOIA response from the New Zealand police, it said, yes, we have been doing this. For example, when a 30-year-old woman was murdered and dropped off the side of a cliff and we had to go and check for her dead body, we outsourced that to a so like these unnecessary and gruesome details relating to someone who closely matched my profile is actually in the police FOIA response from them. So it's that kind of again, it's the repetition. Like it wasn't good enough just for them to plant that idea once. They have to repeat it, and it has to come from this direction and that direction and the other direction, always from an unexpected direction, but repetitive, to build this trigger response.
Horrendous.
So that and then it becomes about like you begin to anticipate it, because once they inflict that type of thing on you so many times, you begin to anticipate, when will be the next time they'll send me this? What will it be this time? Where will it come from this time? What are they going to say today when I'm out doing are these supermarkets? I would go supermarket shopping, and these men would come and walk behind me and talk about me and my life, while within earshot. They wouldn't directly come and talk to me. They would just be this. Even walking through the parking lot of the supermarket, same thing. I'd be pushing my trolley, minding my business, and they would in pairs walk behind me and audibly talk about my life and what was happening for me at the moment, what I was doing, who I was talking to. It is, I guess it's unimaginable if you haven't been through it. I know many activists have been through this type of thing.
It does sound unimaginable and traumatizing. It's the perception that's being created that your life's, obviously that your life's in danger, that there are people everywhere, that
it does seem that they're trying to make you feel like you're boxed in, it's inescapable, it's being inflicted upon you. Everything is always done in such a way that it's virtually impossible to explain to. I mean, I'm really lucky because in 2019, with all of these documents from the intelligence agencies themselves, with the hindsight of the reports in New Zealand admitting that government departments were hiring private intelligence companies who do this type of thing, I can credibly discuss these things as they were happening before any of that validation, before the public knew this type of stuff was going on, before Snowden leaked these documents, before there was any mainstream or conventional understanding that this type of thing happened. It's virtually impossible to explain. It's virtually impossible to explain to someone what's happening, but it's completely impossible to get any redress or to stop it, because the resources that they bring to bear so dramatically outweigh the resources that you have as an individual, particularly me, single mother in the suburbs, independent journalist. How am I supposed to take on teams of people with teams of vehicles and whatnot? And we know now that these teams, they have mobile apps on their phone, and they have like geolocation tracking, and they know where each other are. They can see that one of their operatives has just followed me, one is 500 meters in front of me, two are around the corner going into my house. They can see, they know what they're coordinating, and they're doing it in a visual way. But if you are the target, you don't have the mobile app, you don't have their geolocations, you don't know how many people are tailing you or how many are involved in this team, you don't know really who has hired them. You have to guess who they are, you've got to guess who they work for, you've got to guess, you have some sense of why they're doing it, but you never know the scale. Is there 2 of them or is there 20 of them? Are they just sending me death threats to scare me, or will they actually drive me off the road today? There's so many unknowns.
Horrible, yeah. And to add trauma to trauma, like we were talking about last week, then other people's cues, other people don't have the perceptual cue that you're an activist who's being targeted. If that makes it very easy to plant a cue of mental instability or paranoia or craziness for anybody looking on, which then just compounds the targeting and the smearing and the trauma of all of that. So, probably works on 2 levels in terms of destabilizing the target and, like we were talking about last time, grooming the target's environment so that they can be smeared and discredited, which is what a lot of this is about. And also that's, these slides are about online, and then you're talking about the real world, and we know from the supporting document that JTRIG coordinated with on-the-ground services, including or coordinates. They talk about with these slides, this can be used to coordinate with law enforcement and other intelligence agencies and
so to explain to the viewers, Lissa found another document, a companion document, which is an absolutely fascinating read. And my intention is that once we get through these JTRIG files, we'll go and have a look at that document, because the document in long form and prose describes the applications of the information that's gathered through the surveillance and the online human intelligence in the context of the on-the-ground human intelligence. And that document really ties those 2 together. And in that document, you see that all of this online digital world stuff and the spying and everything else, it's not just passive, it's not just online, it's not just digital, but it's actually paired with the on-the-ground teams of operatives. And I've talked a lot about this in the past in terms of Snowden documents and in terms of also data flows and information flows between the agencies and the on-the-ground subcontractors, usually subcontractors. And there's 2 aspects there. One is that one of the big smears against Snowden and the big myths that's been perpetuated is that Snowden was CIA and he was attacking the NSA. But when you study the documents don't show that. The documents show that the NSA is the right hand of the executive and the CIA is the left hand of the executive, that the NSA gathers the information and the CIA act on it, and that together they are interwoven in all endeavours. and they are interdependent upon each other. That the NSA needs the CIA to do what the CIA does, and the CIA needs the NSA to do what the NSA does, and therefore it's a total myth that they are, while they might compete in small levels in small ways, or certain teams might have some kind of rivalry, they are integral to each other. Their existence, they're codependent, integral to each other. Now, one thing that people used to say to me is, oh, is it the CIA who's tailing you in New Zealand, who's doing the stuff to you? And what I've learned from my study of the documents in my study generally is that the CIA doesn't need to have somebody following me down the street in New Zealand. The CIA doesn't need to have somebody parked outside my house, because the CIA has top-level database access to all of the police and intelligence agency information from all of the partner countries. What this means is that the private intelligence subcontractor, the private investigation firm, or whoever, Thompson Clark Investigations in New Zealand, for example, who are confirmed to have been hired by the government to do this, they are the little plebs on the street with their little mobile app so they can see where each other are doing these horrible, nasty things to me, right? They are reporting to whoever has employed them. Sometimes there's even a middle company in between them, the lawful intercept companies, so-called lawful intercept companies, for example. And then they're reporting that data is then moving into whatever government departments or police agencies, or even the national intelligence agencies in New Zealand. Their databases are all linked in with the New Zealand military, the national intelligence databases, and then those through the New Zealand Military Partnership Agreement with Five Eyes are linked into the Five Eyes databases. And so the CIA can see if a New Zealand police officer comes down my street, sees something and writes a report and sticks it in the New Zealand police database. CIA don't need to hire someone to come to my house and do that in New Zealand. They access that information at the top level. Now, if the CIA decided that they wanted to do a capture kill operation of some person and rendition them to God knows where, to some black site, then the CIA might personally come and do something. But they, in the interim, the huge data conglomerate that is the global network that the Five Eyes and that particularly the NSA are at the center of, allows them to have allows them to use all of the national of each country, national level police and intelligence services as proxy forces, and all of the subcontractors and the private intelligence companies and private investigators who are contracted underneath them also become proxy forces. So while, and I'm just pulling a number out of my ass, while the CIA might have 10,000 employees or 50,000 employees, actually through this, through the global network, as the NSA calls it, the global network, they could have 800,000 employees effectively, just because they are accessing the information of all of the agencies that are at lower levels from them, right down to chump private investigator on the ground coming in, sniffing around my mail or whatever. So it's not that the CIA are like everywhere, the men in black are parked outside my house. That's not how it works at all. All they need is access to the information and to have it at a high level in order for them to be able to benefit from and act on that information if they so choose, or if they desire to. So that's my best summary of that. We have hit 6 o'clock. This in Moscow. This slide I really want to get more into. And we'll just finish by saying stimulating the multiple senses was absolutely something that I constantly would occur as well. So I would have the digital stuff, like them sending me the videos of plane crashes and the social media accounts with serial killers and the emails and whatever else. I would have the crank phone calls as well. And I would have the physical intrusions and like them leaving stuff in my house and that I hadn't bought or brought into my house, interfering with my belongings, etc. They would leave things like they would leave items around my property like that didn't belong. That you see this as well. There's another famous case in New Zealand fairly recently where a researcher on China-New Zealand relations They would take business cards from inside her house, or her own business cards, and then leave them in strategic locations around her property, etc. It's that kind of stuff. But then I also had the constant building sounds. You hear this in Julian Assange's speeches all the time. Whenever Julian would try and speak publicly, there's power drills behind him, there's banging, there's crashing, there's so it was constant and prolonged sounds, and I can't say for sure whether they were actually physically with tools making those sounds or whether they're broadcasting it somehow, but constant intrusion with sound. And God, it was the worst in Berlin, actually. In Berlin, every place I stayed, with a hotel or a short-term apartment or long-stay apartment, I had constant sounds of power drills. And when I say constant, I mean all day, all night. But then someone would come into my house and it would stop like that, like instantly gone. And I actually I have a whole set of recordings of the sound. I started recording the sound so I could prove that it was happening, because the building managers would say, no, there's no renovations going on. There's like concierge would say, no, there's no renovations going on. But there is these incessant sounds of power drills being played to just constantly disturb me and keep me on edge. So yeah, you do.
It's not enough being frightened for your life and having things moved inside your house. And I mean, further down that slide we were just looking at, it talks about creating stress, creating cognitive stress, physical stress, emotional stress. Well,
and that,
you've just talked, I mean, everything you've been talking about. Stress is an understatement. Trauma creates stress and trauma.
Absolutely. So,
I mean, you're talking about creating enormous
stress and trauma, the piece of bad luck. I mean, oh my God, this. So like almost every single person that I was associated with in New Zealand had car accidents, but that they didn't cause. Like, for example, one of the guys who was really helping me with technology stuff, I won't go into it any further than that, his car was T-boned in the exact week that he was helping me on a daily basis, out of nowhere, T-boned, and then drove off. My car, I stopped at a roundabout, what Americans call a rotary, my little hatchback, and this like unmarked white van just at full speed smashes into the back of my car and like rights off the back of my car and shoves me into the rotary. The guy jumps out of the van, comes running up, and you'd expect him to be like, "Are you okay? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that." Instead, he says, "It's my last day of work and now they're going to think I did this to you deliberately."
Wow.
That's literally the first thing he says. And I'm just like, whoa, what? What? What?
Oh my goodness.
But this happened, like, literally everybody on my media team had accidents, people smacking into them, this type of thing. And they would constantly, they'd jostle you in the streets as well. I'd be taking photographs, they come and push me over. This is police as well, at protests. They're just constant, when you're not expecting it, physical impact. Yeah.
It's so extreme that it's understandable that people wouldn't believe that was happening if you told people that was happening, because it's
crazy.
So extreme.
It's crazy.
I mean now there's the IC watch, and I believe there's some other documents that you've got that you'll go through in due course that just lay it out that these are tactics and these are things that people do, and don't just need the word of targets now. There's stuff, out in the public domain that really verifies that these are tactics that are used.
Absolutely.
So,
and this the piece of bad luck, I hadn't actually noticed this before, and I have to look up now Haversack ruse. I don't know if you know anything about it. I definitely need to look
the Haversack ruse is where you lead people to believe, it's a military thing, it's somebody did it with left a backpack that contained some fake instructions about where a battle was going to be, so the enemy put all their forces there when the real attack was somewhere else. So it's basically kind of fake information about where people should direct their efforts.
Interesting, because the piece of bad luck, I mean, it's got to be a principle of theirs, because same thing, like car tire would be penetrated by something, it wouldn't just penetrate the tire, but it would penetrate to the core, like it had been driven into the core of the tire. So then you can't just replace the tire, you have to replace both tires on both sides, and they have to be properly balanced and everything. A few weeks would go by, it happened again. A few weeks would go by, it had happened again. Friend,
maybe that's sorry, go on.
Friend comes in and says, oh, my tire just got punctured, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, oh, really? Like, what did it get punctured with? And they show me a photo, and it's exactly the same item that had gone through my tire. It had been put through my tire. So it's this kind of like, once again, like, you can't prove it, you can't like, but it's back to that repetition. All the sabotage, everything was repetition. And it was one of the most brilliant things actually that my Russian lawyer said to me when I went through all of everything that had happened to me. He said, any single thing that you experienced is explainable. And he said, all of it is not. Like, it cannot be explained, but it's like
sheer volume.
Exactly. It's this consistent, repetitive pattern across this prolonged period that doesn't add up to anything other than targeted harassment.
It's more than bad luck, more than a piece of bad luck.
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
So it sounds like, in that case with the puncturing of the tires and so on, the piece of bad luck is the Haversack-Roos that's keeping you fighting battles that aren't your real battle, perhaps replacing your tires and all of that, as well as making you frightened.
I took it as being about resource depletion as well, because they very much try to financially bleed you. Like, it was very clear they're doing it with my house. So I own my own property. They would cause damage, and then I'd repair it and pay money to repair it, and then they'd repeat the damage, and I'd pay money to repair it, and they'd repeat the damage, and I'd pay money, and it's just this endless cycle. They just inflict financial expenses on you over and over and over and over again that are unsustainable for anybody over a long period of time. So,
it's horrendous. Unbelievable. Believable, but unbelievable.
And we need to finish up here. Yeah. We need to finish up here in a minute, but I do just want to cover this off because this is absolutely true. So creating cognitive stress, I would also get constantly sent conflicting information. I'd be given information, they'd be given information that conflicts with that information, so that I would constantly be having to work out what is true, what is real, which is right, was it right before, is it right now, is there something else I don't know about? So you're constantly thinking.
Yes.
The physiological stress is just blatantly obvious. You are in a constant, and I can tell you, I won't name names, but there are people who are in worse situations than me, or I'll just leave it at that. People who are in worse situations than me, who have become completely adrenally depleted. Their adrenal glands have entirely depleted because they've been kept in such a state of alertness, constant alertness, and constant fear and constant vigilance that and you probably know more about that as a medical condition than I do.
Chronic stress it's physically damaging, and any kind of stress, mental or emotional stress, causes physical stress. It's all part of the same reaction. Your adrenal system fires up if you're feeling stressed. So they're not really separable. The cognitive and the emotional and the physical all go together. And we're designed to have brief bursts of stress. Our body is fine with that. But if it's constant without relief, or almost constant, it's not good for the immune system. It's not good for the cardiovascular system. The whole stress system, adrenal system can get worn out. But and it can cause all kinds of illnesses, physical illnesses, just by, the impacts on the body. So you're right, it's harmful to be chronically extremely stressed and vigilant.
Okay, we'll leave it there for today. I feel like we could go on and on. We could have a 2-week course in understanding deception.
No wonder we're spreading it across 3 webinars if they spend 2 weeks on one component of it.
Developing this.
But do we have time for me to say just really briefly, since we spoke last week, there's been a couple of things that have really driven home how relevant and timely these discussions are. There's, over the last couple of weeks, a report released from a civil rights group about FBI targeting, law enforcement targeting of activists and social movements in the US, peace movements, environmental movements, racial justice movements. And they put together a report about how much of that's been going on and in what way over the last 10 years, which is exactly what we're talking about here. And in Australia, our Prime Minister gave a speech to a Resources Council saying that he thought that non-violent environmental activists advocating boycotts were politically radical and should be criminalised. Didn't specify exactly how to be criminalised, but that should be illegal. And that's a democratically protected right, as we've talked about, right to expression and political organisation. And the idea that the Australian government might invest more in renewable energy and move away from coal is popular with the majority of the Australian population. So to call that politically radical and want to criminalise it is worrying in the context of that report about law enforcement targeting of activists, which all ties in to what we're talking about here, I guess, the methods by which that happens. You there, Susie?
Yeah, I am. So I'm really happy and flattered that you've agreed to spend a third week with me next week going through this.
There's a lot to go through. There's a lot. Sadly, I wish there wasn't. It's terrible that there's a lot to go through.
I still shake my head, like reading these documents. I still just go, I can't believe that people get up and do this to other people. I can't believe that this could be a list of anybody's goals.
Maybe we'll have time next week to talk about the trauma on the operatives who do this work.
Yes, well, there's a very, so whenever we wrap these JTRIG episodes, which maybe it's a 6-episode series at this rate, I will have Elizabeth Mueller back on, because Elizabeth Mueller who's an amazing researcher and activist, has found some fascinating content over the last couple of days. Spoiler alert. About PTSD, these operatives getting PTSD from what they're doing to people, and from witnessing the impacts on it, and getting depression and needing aftercare. So it's taking a toll not just on the targets, but also on these people who are doing these 2-week training courses to learn how to destroy people's lives.
Yeah, no, it's an awful thing to train people to do and pay people to do.
Okay, thank you all so much. Sorry, Alyssa. Thank you all so much for being here. I deeply appreciate it. This is such rare and important information, and it's so deserving of being in the public eye and discussed in the public arena. And there are lives around the world that are at stake. There are targets' lives and maybe even operatives' lives around the world at stake. And sharing this information can really make the difference for someone. How I kept my sanity, without a shadow of a doubt, over the last 8 years, was because I began to learn about what's happening and learn what's happening. And as the puzzle pieces fell into place, things started to make sense that hadn't made sense when I was witnessing them. And that really saved me a great deal of lasting pain. And it's not to say I don't still carry trauma from what was done, but at least when you're sitting here looking at these roadmaps of methodologies that have been employed, and you look at the other testimony of other people in the public arena, and the information that's available about these programs, it really makes a humongous difference. And I released some short videos today from last week, and one of them said, to protect ourselves, we must educate ourselves. And that's very much how I feel. So please take this content, use it, share it, talk about it, spread it around. People need to know this is all being done under the guise of being for the public benefit, and it's clearly not for the public benefit. It's all being done with resources that could be used for the public benefit, that could go to education, could go to healthcare, could go to like vital social services that we need, and that we're deprived of in our societies, while the military funnel our resources, our public resources, into destroying people's lives. It's not good enough, and talking about it is the first step towards stopping it. If you'd like to support me personally and this campaign, please go to VS 5i.com/donate, and I will see you same time next week. No, next week we're going to change it to 7 p.m. Eastern, and that will make my life a little bit easier with daylight savings. Okay, thank you all so much. See you next week. Take care.
Thank you, Susie.
Thank you, Lisa.
Pleasure. Bye.
Hi, my name is Susie. I'm an activist and a journalist from Auckland, New Zealand. For years, I've worked on controversial issues like the corruption of our intelligence agencies. I was severely targeted as a result of my work. This led to my articles being amplified by the world's most accomplished publisher. In 2016, I made a documentary about how and why I was forced to leave my country. I have now sought refuge in Russia, and my situation has become public.
On 882 6PR, the voice of Perth.
It's 12:30 right now, and Tony with you, and I'm really happy we finally got through to Moscow to my friend over there, Susie Dawson.
You're listening to a 95BFM podcast.
Susie Dawson is a Kiwi activist and journalist who worked as a member of Occupy Auckland's media team at that time. Now, 5 years later, and following involvement in GCSB and TPPA opposition, she's seeking asylum in Russia, alleging she has been spied on, harassed and threatened by the police.
Welcome back to The Wire. Now, finally on the show today, last week it was announced that Susie Dawson will be the new leader of the Internet Party.
Welcome to the Jimmy Dore Show. We have a special guest with us. It's Susie Dawson. She's an activist, journalist, former party leader, and current president of the Internet Party.
Susie Dawson, an activist and citizen journalist currently seeking asylum in Moscow. Susie has written extensively on surveillance and the deep state and claims it's not safe for her in New Zealand.
My name is Craig Tuck. I'm a lawyer from New Zealand. I act in the area of international human rights. I act for Susie Dawson, along with a group of other lawyers throughout the world who act for journalists and dissenters in high-profile cases, including the case of Julian Assange. As far back as 2012, Susie has been trying to warn New Zealanders and other citizens around the world about state targeting and surveillance of citizens and the methods being used to do it.
Surveillance in New Zealand is now so widespread, it's not an issue of police going and getting a warrant and doing an investigation and then it all coming out in court. The vast majority of the surveillance that's undertaken is never going to be aired in a courtroom. And by that I'm talking about cell phone technologies. I'm talking about lawful interception is the term that the companies that do this like to use. There is a corporation in Wellington, New Zealand called SSI Corp. And you can Google them and you can look at their website. And on their website, they're so good as to explain at length exactly what they do and how legal it is for them to do it. And essentially, they can intercept virtually any communication. If they have someone at range, they can hear your actual conversations, but also through cell phones, they can essentially turn them into microphones and hear any conversation that's had within vicinity. They can see your text messages, they can see what photos are on your phone, they can see what files are on your phone, they can read your emails, they can just intercept all kinds of information.
Any intelligence service in the world that has significant funding and a real technological research team can own that phone the minute it connects to their network. As soon as you turn it on, it can be theirs. They can turn it into a microphone, they can take pictures from it, they can take the data off of it. But it's important to understand that these things are typically done on a targeted basis.
Not only was Susie essentially blowing a whistle on state-level spying, she was naming the precise entities that years later it would be proven had in fact been doing it.
And the fact that these are private corporations that are doing it should be really concerning to us. The crowd that they outsourced it to was TCIL, which was, I believe, Thompson and Clark, Investigations Limited. The state is contracting a private company to surveil you. To me, that's really immoral. Absolutely immoral.
Some 6 years later, in December 2018, an official State Services Commission report confirmed that New Zealand government agencies had been employing Thompson and Clark Investigations Limited to target New Zealand citizens. This is a private company that had essentially been instructed by state agencies and departments to spy on citizens.
More than a dozen police staff are under investigation for passing sensitive information to the private investigators Thompson and Clark.
Thompson and Clark. Security firm Thompson and Clark.
Thompson and Clark.
Thompson and Clark.
So Thompson and Clark, aren't some of them old police officers?
Yes, they are.
Okay, so does that explain the relationship and the free flow of information? Doesn't it actually seem a bit crass?
Well, at the end of the day, I guess what I trust is people's intent.
The report identifies perhaps inappropriately close relationships, morning teas paid for by Thompson and Clark, invitations to go out for drinks. Were there other companies identified where you inappropriately gave them information, or just Thompson and Clark?
There are a myriad of security companies who inquire of police every day. For instance, insurance security.
But that's not my question. People listening to this will think, hey, Thompson and Clark were getting stellar, top shelf, gold star treatment from the police. Why? Do you treat other security firms the same as you were treating this one? And how do you seriously think it looks to members of the public listening to this?
Thompson and Clark hasn't just been paid by the government to spy on Greenpeace and earthquake claimants in Christchurch. Tonight, Checkpoint can reveal the controversial security firm has been also monitoring the activities of another 3 activist groups in Northland, Coromandel and Wellington, and the activities of at least 1 further claimant.
Susie has been involved at the very highest levels, with people facing charges from prosecutions coming out of the Eastern District Court of Virginia in the United States. There are more prosecutions to follow of currently unnamed persons. Importantly, information will be coming out in the months to come that will provide transparency and clarity and lead to accountability. Suppression and prosecution of dissenters can't be allowed in New Zealand or elsewhere. That's why Susie's team is launching the hashtag #OneVersus5I campaign, and with your help can achieve some important victories for democracy and for each and every one of us.